Thank you so much, Ashley. Thanks, everybody. I'm really, really happy to be here. I always love to come out here. Thank you for making the weather very familiar to me at home in Oregon. So I'm excited about that. I don't like to see sunshine. I made a directive that no one here should have Wi-Fi so that you're all totally, fully single tasking on me. But I hear maybe they're working on that. And one other thing that I want you to know is that the slides for today are not available right now, and that's because I was working on them late last night, half of them anyways. So you're going to get some all-new stuff that nobody has seen before, except for possibly me. But I will make sure you have all of the materials that I share with you today. So you'll have it all. What I'd really like you to do is just kind of be present with it. There is actually some research out there that says if you have the handouts ahead of time, if you have the slides ahead of time, your engagement goes down. You start looking ahead, looking back, saying, I already know that, I don't know this thing, and then all of a sudden, you're not paying attention to the content. So hopefully all of that works well, and I've convinced you that that was a good reason for me to be working late last night on these slides. Perhaps, perhaps not. So we're going to spend the next 3 hours talking about equity in school discipline and a specific focus on strategies for what to do. I hope that's what you're here for. If not, that's what you're going to get anyways. And I want to start with a little bit of thanks. I want to thank you for being here for this session. I want to thank you for the attention that you're giving to ensuring that all students are successful. And I always like to start with a joke, even a bad one. This one says, I know the kids don't like you and they pick on you, but you have to go to school. You are the teacher. This is a rough time to be an educator these days, and I want to acknowledge that. My wife is teaching today. I came from the classroom, and there's a lot that is being laid on teachers' shoulders, but who better to be able to take it on than the people with the passion and the face time with kids to do it. So thank you for that. I also want to thank the PBIS Center and the disproportionality work group of the center. They create a lot of the materials that I'm going to be sharing with you. So if there's something you see and it's really, really good, you probably need to thank somebody up there as opposed to me in particular. But I also want to get to know you a little bit. So what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to put some words up on the screen, and I'll say them too, so we'll do multimodal. And what I'd like you to do is, if it applies to you, I want to say in your big teacher voice, that's me, okay? So, number one, how many of you work primarily with students and their families? That was not your teacher voice. Okay. How many of you work primarily as school administrators? Okay, you sound like under-caffeinated right now. How many people work primarily at a district level or county level? All right, and how many of you at the state level?
That's me!
Yeah, I thought that you all would be loud. Okay, how many of you are going to school to learn how to do one of these things? All right, wonderful. All right, a couple other questions. How many of you work primarily with little kiddos, early childhood? All right. How many work primarily in elementary schools? All right. How about middle schools? High schools? Oh, they'll probably be about 5 minutes late. No knock. I taught high school. Come on. Okay. How many people are working in a school implementing PBIS? Okay. So that's about roughly half of you there. Okay. Some of you are looking at each other saying, why did you say that's me, or why didn't you say that's me? So that's kind of interesting. All right, how many of you have somebody else from your team, and I'm going to say team broadly here? Okay, whew. Just checking. We're going to be doing some work, some activities, and some of them are going to be specifically team-based. If not, you can be a team of one or join with somebody else, and I think that'll be fine. I'm also going to ask you one more question here. On a scale of 1 to 5, how well do you feel you know PBIS? So number 1 is, what does that stand for? 5 is like, I got it, why are you up there? How come I'm not up there? Okay. This is a little bit challenged by choice, but I do want to see, if your hand doesn't go up, I'm going to assume it's a 1 or a 2, maybe a 3. Okay, that's particularly useful for me as I move forward with some of this. If I'm making an assumption and you don't know exactly what it is, feel free to ask away. I have an 8-year-old and a 7-year-old at home, so I am used to being interrupted. So please do ask if it's something that we want to connect with part of the way through, or over lunch I might ask to wait then, or a reception. But I want to get you to start really, really quick. Turn to somebody next to you. They might be one of those people on your team. They might be somebody you haven't met yet. So if you haven't met them yet, please do introduce yourself and share for 1 minute each what's something you want to get out of the session this morning. And then bring your attention back to the room in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. So who would like to get started? You can just shout out something you want. If that doesn't feel comfortable to you, you can raise your hand and I can call on you. Tier 2 services. Great question. So I'm gonna do a little bit of a description of that. So hopefully some of you are familiar with tiered support and tiers 1, tier 2, and tier 3. So tier 1 for everybody, tier 2 for some, and tier 3 for a few. One of the things that's really important in talking about equity, so I'm really glad you brought it up, Pat, is that the equity work that you do in your schools should be your tier 1 systems work. Not that you're trying to fix equity in school discipline at tier 2. Now you can, obviously, I think you're not asking about that, but you're really asking about cultural responsive support at tier 2. And maybe I'll chat with you over lunch or at the reception about that one, because I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on tier 1 today. Thank you for asking. Anybody else? The best jokes? My son just told me a joke. I don't know if it's the best joke. Do you know what the first year where there were bees? He was telling me he was very excited about this in school. First year that there were bees. The beginning. He's 7, so I think that's pretty good for him. Anyways, okay. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to jump right into the stuff. I think we're going to have a lot of good opportunities to work into this, and probably some of the things you're thinking about are all things that we're going to talk through. So we're going to do a little awareness activity at the beginning. It's a little bit more of a staff one than necessarily to do with students. And I'm going to fit all of this in a short amount of time. So I'm going to try to talk quickly for some of it, but we're going to spend enough time doing the activities that you'll get a sense and be able to do it. The other thing that I want to do is I want to lay out some ground rules for us in doing this work. Like I said, feel free to ask questions anytime you want, and I've already done some good modeling, and you've done some good asking for things that I might talk about later as opposed to right now. Number 2, I want you to speak your truth, and what I mean by that is that everybody has a truth to tell, and by acknowledging that you speak your truth, that also might mean that your truth is going to be different from other people's truths in this room. We want to acknowledge that. Number 3, no assumptions except good intentions. You're all here for improving outcomes for students, and so I want to make sure that we move forward in that way, and that we're an open group here, which means sometimes we're going to make mistakes with each other. Sometimes we might say some things that are not quite perfect or not exactly how that lines up with other people's truths, and I think that's okay. And then the last one is that I want you to be comfortable with discomfort. And what I mean by that is if you're doing equity work, it's not always easy. I think we'll have some fun. I think we'll do some interesting activities. But if you don't feel a little bit uncomfortable at some point this morning, then I have not done my job, because that is part of it. And actually part of being uncomfortable, doing good equity work, is being uncomfortable and learning how to be part with it. as opposed to just pushing it off and blaming other people for the problems. All right? Everybody okay with that? Yeah. So at any given time when I'm talking this morning, you might feel like one of these two dogs around the table. And that's okay. That's fine. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with a little bit of an activity. You have in your packet in front of you, if you don't have one, please raise your hand, and I will get it to you. Oh, there you are. Oh, Catherine's going to get it to you.
I tried to get people to come up front. It didn't work.
Nice try. That's a good tier 1 intervention. Okay. So what this activity I call is the Elements of Culture activity. It is part of a resource called the Cultural Responsiveness Field Guide that is available for free on the pbis.org website. It's on the equity page. And what we're going to do is this is an activity that you can do. We'll do it here, and then you'll also do it. You can do it with at a staff meeting. You can do it. I haven't seen people do it as much with students because it's a little bit more of an adult one, although you might be able to. So what you've got here to do this is you've got these a column of elements of culture, and there's no rules about which ones have to be here, have to not be here. I think you would leave it open. In this example, we start with an example up here, and then I've got some things that start with a little bit of that maybe are not quite as intense as some other ones. Then you move down. In this example here, I'm going to assume you are at a school where your data are showing maybe that there are some issues regarding race or ethnicity related to appropriate responses to insults, okay? There's nothing magic about these 5 that are up here. But what I've done is I'm going to give you an example, and you've got it all laid out for you up there so you can see what this is all about, and then I'll ask you to do these. So what you do is you just take for each one of these, you identify what were my norms, what were the sort of unwritten rules about each of these growing up? What are my norms now? What are our school's norms? And if you're not at one particular school, it's probably going to be useful to think. You could think about broadly, if you're at the district level, about our district, or you might think of a particular school. How my students and families might be different, and then how those differences could create conflict or lead to some misunderstanding. So I'm going to walk you through an example of this, and then I'll ask you to move with the other ones. So this is appropriate language. So here's number 1, my norms growing up. Okay, so that is that I was supposed to be formal and respectful with all of my language, especially to people older than me. Okay, this is not mine, for example, but it's one that the person building the activity did. Now my norms now is respect for everybody, but I don't really, the formal language, I can be a little bit more casual with people who I've met and work with. It doesn't have to be quite so formal. Our school norms, maybe they are formal and respectful from students to staff and between students, but maybe not necessarily between staff. How my students and families might be different, might use less formal language in everyday interaction, might not. And maybe sometimes, in terms of respect, maybe use of a little bit more profanity than I might be used to express extreme emotion. And then how these differences might create conflict. I might view my students or those families as being disrespectful when they're in difficult situations. Does that make sense? So here's what I'd like you to do. You all have one in front of you. I would like you to go through and actually write out in here, fill in the blanks for these. And if you don't get through all of them in the amount of time that I'm going to give you, that's perfectly fine. But then what I'd like you to do is when you're done, so I would say take about 10 minutes to do this. And if you don't get all the way through in 10 minutes, totally fine. That works. Once you're finished and I will call out the 10 minutes, what I'd like you to do is actually physically stand up, find somebody who you have not met yet, and just debrief. Debrief, what is, you could pick one particular row on here. So you might say, let's talk about voice level. That was kind of interesting for me. Negotiate how you're going to do that. talk about a personal aha, and then talk about how useful this activity might be. Okay, so on a scale of 1 to 5, how well do you know what I'm asking you to do for the next 10 minutes? Doing good? Okay, a little check for understanding. Great. Okay, so begin. Okay, thank you for all coming back to your seats. I'll do that regularly about when we do activities, just to get a sense of how much more time or less time than you need. Each group is a little bit different, and I'm always trying to figure out what's about the average. So thank you. All right, so what was a personal aha that you had or the person you were with had? Something that just sort of clicked for you and, oh, that's interesting. Please. What's happening? So you're starting to think about where this fits in and what would be useful and not. And I think what I'm hearing from you is if this is really different from this, we may want to just question that. And it may not be to say everything has to look like the middle row or everything has to look like the fourth row or column, but just to kind of unpack it a little bit. And you're thinking, yeah, you might do this right before building your expectations and before you build your matrix. Great, thank you. Please, Bridget. Yeah, I like that. And what was interesting that you were describing is you were talking about self-awareness in relation to norms. And norms are kind of funny things, right? They're generally unwritten rules. And so people might have different interpretations of it. Sometimes I'll have people do this and they'll look at this column right here, our school norms, and they'll say, I don't know how to fill that out. I don't know. I don't think our school has norms. And so the answer to that, my answer to that is, oh, your school definitely has norms. One of the norms could be every person for herself, right? That's certainly possible, that it's sort of each little queendom of each classroom is taken care of by itself, and nobody shall, intrude on anything. And that might actually be a norm that might be worth asking about to what extent could a little bit of collaboration help us out a little bit more in breaking those down. But being able to actually, as you were saying, Trish, write these down on a sheet can be helpful for us to go, and even a blank cell on here, a blank box in here, can be a little bit of an aha moment. I know for me, one of the things that was really interesting when I was doing this was this thing about appropriate dress for my norms growing up and my norms now. And I will tell you that the high school me would be very upset with the present me right now with a collared shirt and creased khakis, right? I don't know how many of you did, but at least for me, one of the norms that I had growing up was, can I dress in a way to piss off the greatest number of adults around me at the time? And then that changes, which is really interesting because sometimes people say, oh yeah, everything has stayed the same over time, and some people go, no, I think that's just sort of, that was relevant to an era, or that was relevant to me personally then, but there was not a universal norm for that. And I'm sure some of you are looking at me shocked that I would say that those were my norms in high school, right? Many of you were not thinking, what is the edge of the dress code where I have to get the adults to really think about how appropriate it was, right? Okay. Anything else you want to share about this? Please, Pat. Yeah. And your example here fits really nicely in the appropriate language. When you think about, I have to learn all of the emojis and which ones each one of them means so I don't accidentally say something really, really bad when I was really just talking about what I wanted for dinner or, something like that. And you got to learn that stuff, right? Yeah, for sure. And it is interesting. One of the things that some of you might look up and say, hey, look right up here. You are stereotyping. You're stereotyping your students. You're stereotyping your students' families. We also want to think a little bit about this idea of acculturation. that just because a student comes from a particular background, their relation to their family culture, their parents' culture, their grandparents' culture is really, really different. And so we can get into a little bit of trouble if we start thinking in the sort of all of our students might feel like that, all of our families might feel like that. We might even be in more trouble if we do that. So there's a little bit of a balance there. But this idea of self-awareness and being really clear about norms, one of the worst things to do is to be, for those of you, I'd really like to travel to other countries until I had kids, then no. But it's very, very uncomfortable when you're in a situation and you've done something wrong and you have no idea what it was. So my wife, for our honeymoon, we went to Guatemala. And we would be having dinner and hanging out, and we would just be there forever and ever and ever and ever, waiting for the check. Everybody is gone. They're packing up. And we're thinking, we're getting kind of bad service, right? But the cultural norm there is it would be rude for somebody to bring a check to you. You need to ask them for a check. And it was pretty funny because it's like midnight for especially the first week we were there, and we were like, what's going on? This service here is terrible. And it was actually, that's just a norm that we didn't know. And so by making those norms a little bit more explicit, we end up reducing those landmines of everybody in Guatemala is rude, or making really weird assumptions like that. So this is a really nice one to use at a staff meeting. We just did this. We did 10 minutes on your own. You did 5 minutes with your peers, and we did about 5 minutes. We did about 10 minutes sharing out afterwards. So that's an activity that you could easily fold in. And one of the things that I like about this one is it's a little bit low stakes. It's not really boom head on like some of the other things that you might do, but it's a really good one of just saying, I just sprung this on you. Granted, you're coming here to come to a session on equity, so you're going to assume that I'm going to be talking about this. But it's not in of itself, on its face, directly addressing it. But then somehow some of these discussions just start happening without somebody at the front of the room needing to lead that. So that's one of the things that I really like about this one. Okay. So I also talked about discomfort. Now let's start talking about discomfort and data here. These are the most recent federal data looking at disproportionality in school discipline. And I know these are a little small for you to see, but I'm going to describe it out for you. This is something called the Out-of-School Suspension Risk Index, which means the percent of students who have been suspended out of school at least once during the school year. Okay? It could be once, it could be 75 times, it's still in there. What we've got down here is all, that is 5%. What this says is nationwide, 5% of students K-12 were suspended out of school at least once during the school year. Okay, for those of you who have good vision, for those of you who have, can guess, what's the highest bar on there? Yeah, Black or African American students. Right here, 13%, way higher than all the rest. How about the number 2 on there? Students with disabilities. And you may have heard about something called intersectionality or intersectional risk. You probably would not be surprised that Black students with disabilities are at an exponentially higher risk of being suspended. So in this school year, this most recent year where we've crunched all of the federal numbers, 1 in 5 districts in the country suspended more than half of their Black students with disabilities in secondary school. 1 in 5 schools, 1 in 5 districts in the country suspended more than half. That's big. Please. Oh, yeah, so it's at the district level, which is kind of interesting. And I know that some of you are in are in situations where your numbers of students of color, and particularly Black or African American students, are really small. So the issue becomes, you might say, yeah, we suspended 2 out of 4, let's say, in our high school. And so you might say, well, that's just 2 students, and so like any one situation could have made things different. And the challenge with that is that there are so many schools around the country that are doing that if you look at it like this kid, but that pattern is there across the whole country. So there are many schools saying, yeah, that's about the same. So those are districts there. Thank you for asking, by the way. You all might be interested also in looking at the Hispanic, Latino, Latinx students and that risk. It's not broken down by grade levels here, but what we see nationally is that in elementary school, Latinx students are less likely to be suspended than white students, than average. When you get to middle school, it's variable, and when you get to high school, you see disproportionality shoot right up. And we can think about that a little bit. I don't know, I see a few people nodding their heads, so it sounds like it's matching some of your data. And you can kind of think a little bit about how that might, why that pattern might be. But we don't have really good answers right now, so we can just sort of keep thinking about it. But I want to describe a couple of things here. One thing is anytime you start showing equity data, you'll get a number of common questions that people have. And sometimes they've got them in their heads, and sometimes they'll ask them and be brave to do it. But I like to kind of lay them out there so that people can see and talk about it. Because usually if one person is thinking it, oftentimes more people are. So some of those things that I see up here, it's really common when we start showing racial discipline data and ethnic discipline data, people start saying, I think, because of the correlation between socioeconomic status and race, and more of our students of color are poor, maybe, is it possible that we have a poverty problem, not a race problem? And the research is fairly clear that poverty does play a role in it, but when you control for poverty, you still see racial differences. And I'm going to give you an example because that's a little bit hard to understand, and I'm talking in my nerdy statistical world. So what I did is I took this research study from Yolanda Anion and colleagues. She was looking at a large school district in the western United States. And what she did is she calculated odds ratios. So an odds ratio, it's a little bit like that risk ratio, but it's a little bit different in that if an odds ratio is 1.0, that group is no more or less likely to get the outcome than anybody else. If it's below, that means they're less likely. If it's above, that means they're more likely. So you've got different outcomes here. One is office discipline referrals, or ODRs. You'll see me throw that all the way through our stuff. Suspensions, arrests, and expulsions. And you see this black bar for black students and the yellow bar for students receiving free and reduced lunch. So that's showing an indication of poverty. So what you're seeing here is if you're black or if you're receiving free or reduced lunch, you're a little bit more than twice as likely as non-black or students not getting free and reduced to get sent to the office. So let's look as it starts going farther down the road. For suspensions, all of a sudden we see if you're free and reduced lunch, no more or less likely. But if you're black, you're still you're 1.5 times more likely to be suspended. Being arrested on campus, still up there. All of a sudden, free and reduced actually starts dropping, and expulsion right on there. So it shows that there's some places where poverty makes a difference and other places where race is the big thing here. So another one that sometimes we get is maybe we see differences because there are just different base rates there. Question in the back, Jody. I can go back one. I have the technology. Uh-huh. This is all schools in one large district. Yeah, so this is not broken down by grade level. Although there's no reason for these ones here, there's no reason to think that there are differences across elementary, middle, and high, like there might be if I was showing these data for Latinx students. Thank you. So you caught me at a cliffhanger on this one. Maybe we just see, maybe the more black students are sent to the office because they're just, have more problem behavior. And there have been a number of studies looking at this. And in fact, one of them, and this one was a really strongly controlled study from one of my colleagues, Catherine Bradshaw at the University of Virginia, asked teachers to rate the levels of problem behavior of every student in their classroom, and then compared those ratings, those teacher ratings of problem behavior, to how often those teachers sent students to the office, and found that even when controlling for those ratings of problem behavior, those same teachers were twice as likely to send black students to the office. Please.
Could this be an implicit bias issue?
Well, that's what we're sort of moving toward here, yeah. And that's why when we start talking about cultural responsiveness, you might even be thinking, what about this activity that we did? And maybe is this activity we did related to it? So that's a perfect segue to the next one on there. Are you just saying that we educators are terrible people who are evil and really want to put one group down over another group? And the research is pretty clear from what we've done and what other people have done that disproportionality that we see, the main root of it comes from implicit or unconscious bias. It's not intentional, but it still results in the outcomes that we see. So one of my colleagues at the University of Oregon School of Law, Eric Gervin, really, really smart guy, we did an analysis nationwide of school data and looking at disproportionality. And if you take out referrals for defiance, disrespect, and disruption, you see 0 race differences across the whole country. No racial differences except for those 3. So what are those? Yeah, the 3 Ds: defiance, disrespect, and disruption. There's a 4th D in there also that I think in high schools you might appreciate is dress code. But our analyses didn't look at dress code. So yeah, and I'd be happy to, if you want to get a hold of me, I'd be happy to send that to you. That study is in press right now. So what is it about those 3 Ds? What is it about those 3 Ds that's different from everything else? Please.
It could be cultural norms can impact the voice level.
Yeah.
Or the way that they look at you when they're talking to you, or any of those types of behaviors that could be disrespectful or defiant.
Right. That starts moving me back right to my restaurant experience in Guatemala. That goes right back to differences in volume or maybe differences in intensity of emotion that's okay to express in a classroom or in the hallway or with peers. And it's those differences in the columns that might make a difference whether this person gets sent to the office and this person doesn't get sent to the office or gets a warning or something like that. Yeah. And so it moves us a little bit away from this sort of conscious racism as a problem, but the unconscious bias or implicit bias is still a concern because it's still leading to these outcomes. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an example, and then we're going to move on to some more specific activities. So I'm going to ask you this one. I want you to think in your head, you do not have to share this with a peer. What percent do you think of the US population right now, black population versus white population, is incarcerated? Meaning in jail, in prison, awaiting sentencing, any kind of state-sponsored custody. Okay? Like I said, don't share it with your peer. Okay, so here's some percents here. Percent of group incarcerated. This is the same as the way that we calculate the suspension data. Here's for black individuals and white individuals. Okay. This is what I thought. This is not true. Those are the numbers. Those are the real numbers from the census showing that. And so if your thinking was like me, that it was this higher number, you may have heard somebody say there are more black men in prison than there are in college. That's actually not true. This number right here, does that change the way that you walk into a situation based on that? And was my guess that I had over here related to direct contact with people or something indirect that I heard from the media, that I heard from other people, that I guessed, that I read online without actually having direct contact? But that changes it. So this is under 3%. And if you take away nonviolent drug convictions, it's under 1% for both groups. But that might actually, this perception that we have might actually relate to school. So for our early educator people in the room, you might know, and other people might not, that there is more disproportionality in preschool suspensions than in K-12. Okay? So the numbers here. Black children, 19% of preschool enrollment, but 47% of preschool suspensions. 41% for white students, but 28% of preschool suspensions. So a colleague of mine, Walter Gilliam, did this really interesting study at an early education conference. And what he did is he was in the exhibitor, the expo room. So there was, the people go into selling stuff, and you'd go in to get like the squishy ball for your kid because you think they'll like it, but they end up just chewing on it or whatever. What they did is they said, hey, participate in a study. What I want you to do is I want you to just sit and watch this video, and I just want you to watch some kids in preschool who are in an activity, and I just want you to watch for problem behavior. And what they did, and they said they had this, they used eye tracking equipment to look and see who was looking who. And what you can see is there were multiple angles, so it wasn't just everybody looking on the left or something like that. So here is a cut when they were looking at the white boy, the black girl, the black boy, and the white girl. So here's the thing that was interesting about this. All of these kids in this video, so there was actually no problem behavior in the video. These were all child actors. So there was no problem behavior to see. But there were huge differences in what people look for. And there were race differences and gender differences too. So when people said, watch for problem behavior, they were looking at the black boy, and they were also looking at the white boy, and they were not looking at these kids over here. Now, as the parent of a former preschooler, two former preschoolers, anybody will tell you, if you look long enough at a preschooler for problem behavior, you will find it. And if you're looking more for some students, you're going to see more. And if you view it as a learning opportunity, then that's great. If you don't, then it gets a little bit more problematic. You might also be neglecting to look for people who might need a little bit of instruction or a little bit of support too. All right. So I could go on for an entire day on this, but I'm not. There's a great video. This is like a 4-minute video. You could watch it if you wanted to with your staff on the research behind implicit bias. Really, really good, short in there. One of my colleagues, Rosemary Allen from Metro State University in Denver, Colorado, is fond of saying, if you're aware, you're halfway there. Just becoming aware of your biases and your tendencies is already a really good first step. But, of course, for those pessimists in the room, you also know that if you're aware, you're only halfway there. So that's what we're going to talk about here. And I'm going to start by talking about what probably a lot of you are doing to address discipline in your schools, implementing PBIS. There's lots of schools implementing. not just in the US, but in over 20 countries around the world. And people do it because it works. There's lots of research showing really good outcomes. Decreased problem behavior, decreased bullying, increased social emotional competence, increased academic achievement, actually decreased burnout for adults in the building. So those are all really good. But one of the questions that we've been thinking of lately is, those are overall findings. Are they true for everybody? So here's a little question based on that. Let's see if you can figure it out. All right. Some of you got it. Right? Welcome, home of the dogs. And then what does it say down here? No dogs. Right. But we actually have some fairly good research coming out now showing some case studies across a few different states that when you implement PBIS and attend to cultural responsiveness, and I'll describe some of those things as we keep going throughout, you actually get some good outcomes. And even if you don't, you might get some good outcomes too. So this is a evaluation brief looking at nationwide effects of PBIS on the discipline gap. So here's the picture from it. If you remember these blue bars, those are the exact same bars that I showed you before. This is out of school suspension risk index. And what you've got here, so remember that was our 5% over here. That's all of the schools in the country. Here are schools implementing PBIS with fidelity of implementation. So using a measure that's showing that they're implementing enough critical features to make it work. And what you see here is this is a 20% decrease, which is nice to see, but it's not even across everywhere. We actually see some differences, particularly where we're looking most, where we're most concerned. But do you look at that and you say, this is great, we're happy, it's a little bit lower? I know I don't. But I see this as a good start. We can also see the same thing in different districts looking at students with disabilities. The disability discipline gap shrinks, doesn't totally disappear, but does decrease over time. So what I say when I look at this is I say, hey, we've got something that is at least an all right framework for us to build on, right? We can add additional interventions to get to the outcomes that we want to see. And a little bit more research here. There are a few studies that have looked at, are there specific parts of PBIS that are more related to disciplinary equity than others? And they found a few things. Number one, schools that use their discipline data for decision-making more have lower disproportionality in black-white suspensions. Schools that implement classroom PBIS systems better have lower disproportionality in suspensions. And this one across multiple studies, schools that do a better job having formal reward systems for acknowledging positive behavior have significantly decreased disproportionality. So I really like this quote from this guy named Alex Haley. Anybody heard of him? He wrote Roots. He was talking about his writing, but I think it matches really nicely. In my writing, as much as I could, I tried to find the good and praise it. When we're looking for instances to acknowledge pro-social behavior, we're going to see more of it, and we're going to be able to encourage more of it. That's really different from look for problem behavior and see if you can find it. Okay. So I think I mentioned before, we do have a field guide that has been out for a few years that has a number of different either approaches, strategies, activities, and lesson plans for increasing equity in school discipline by making our PBIS systems more culturally responsive. And so that's what we're going to spend the rest of our time here doing. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through our core practices of Tier 1 PBIS with the idea that equity, as I was saying before to Pat, is a Tier 1 issue. So we've got to change our Tier 1 systems. So when we think about what things we want to do for everybody, number one, we want to be really clear about what our norms are and actually get agreement on them. Number two, we want to teach those directly. And then number three, we want to monitor and acknowledge pro-social behavior, as I said. Reward systems are an important part of that. We want to provide instructional consequences for unwanted behavior, and then use data for decision making. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk for the rest of the time, because we don't have a whole few days for this, really focus on number one and number two today. And you can get some of the other info in here. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to describe how all of these might relate to interactions, particularly interactions in the classroom, that would lead to disproportionate outcomes. So here's a little picture here. This is called a 4-term contingency. Anybody seen these 4 boxes before? All right, some of you out there. If you haven't, it's actually a really, really helpful way for understanding behavior that we want to change. And I'm going to do this the really, really fast way. So those of you who know the 4 boxes are going to be angry with me, but that's all right. What this does is this just describes a chain of behavior that might be more likely to happen if each one of these steps occur. So what this says is that when there are few positive interactions with adults in the building, and students view school as less relevant, then when students experience negative interactions, perceived slights, conflicts with adults, maybe conflicts with which norms or which are operating, a student might be more likely to respond in a way that we don't want, unwanted or unexpected behavior. A lot of times people call this problem behavior, but I really want to note that problem is defined by the person seeing it. So I'm more often calling it unwanted behavior, because that situates it as a decision that we're making about what's okay and what's not. And that when that happens, the student is sent to the office, everybody gets out of that social interaction. The student gets out of it, and the adult in the classroom get out of it. Okay? So this is the thing we want to change. This is the thing that happens right before. This is the thing that happens that makes it more likely. And this is the thing that happens that makes them more likely to do it next time. So we call this a coercive cycle. It is a dance that people unwittingly get into, the student and the teacher, or the child and the adult in the situation. But we can fix this. So number one is, if we define what we want in terms of the norms that we have, we might reduce a little bit of miscommunication and assumptions. We need to avoid what one of my favorite teachers, Anita Archer, calls assumicide, when we assume that students know what's expected of them without actually teaching it. We can also define how we want students to respond when something doesn't go exactly the way they're expecting. We can teach those responses. We can increase the acknowledgement to decrease the likelihood that this happens here. And we can respond in ways that are instructionally, and we can use our data to help make sure that we're addressing all of these. Which moves us into a constructive cycle, which says when a student has lots of positive interactions in the building, and they see school and the lessons they're getting as more relevant. We'll talk a little bit about that. They might experience fewer experiences of academic failure, unintended slights, and conflicts. But when they do, they might actually use those skills that we're teaching And when there is still unwanted behavior, we respond instructionally as a coach instead of a security guard telling them what they did wrong. And what that does is that just feeds forward all of these positive interactions moving forward. So I'm going to spend time talking about number one, defining positive school-wide expectations. Most of you are probably familiar, and then we'll go through these, but like I said before, I'm going to stop at number two. So first, number one, being really, really clear with your rules, always good. Does this look like a good set of expectations for you? It's clear? No. So yeah, you figured that out, right? Lots of no's. It's not what we want to see. We want to point positive. We want to be looking at what we want to see instead of just labeling what we don't want to see, because that's the more instructive way of doing it. So there's a school, they got their 3 expectations. They're short, so it's a little easy to move with it. So here are the things. Some of you are already going to know this. Some of you are learning a little bit about it. Number one, there's a small number of them. That's mostly so that we can remember them. Not just the students, but also the adults in the building. They're broad. They cover everything that we would actually want a student to do and not want a student to do. They're memorable in some way, shape, or form, although you got to be a little bit careful not to stretch out your acronyms too much to make your expectations match your school mascot. Sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't work. And they have to be positively stated. So sometimes our rules are not always matching up like that. Here's a picture. This is in Florida, very close to where Ashley grew up. This says hikers and bikers move to the side of the road when a vehicle approaches. Who is that rule written for? The alligators. Yeah, exactly. We might look and see if our rules kind of fit like that. And there are a lot of people out there who really say if we call them expectations or we call them rules, then we're already kind of like moving on the wrong foot, because people are used to rules being lots of things to know. Not uncommon, particularly in high school settings, to do. Sometimes people call them agreements. I'm a little iffy on that if students don't actually agree to them. It's not really an agreement in my mind. But you might also just fit it right into the culture of the school, so it just sort of blends in to what it looks like. And the biggest way that it blends into what it looks like is people use the words regularly in their interactions with students. And those are the things that are really, really key, right? You've got all of these critical features, and we use them regularly over time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a menu of things that you can do to address number one, and maybe make some tweaks to your systems or build your systems as you're going through them. If you see a page number on here, that's related to the Cultural Responsiveness Field Guide, which you can grab as soon as you have internet access. And I'm gonna walk you through each one of these. We've already done the staff identity awareness, is that elements of culture. There are a few more, I believe, in there that you can do, and you can also think of some other ones. And then we're also going to do a little bit of looking at what we have to match. So we got that one done. Then we're going to talk about an expectations matrix. People are familiar with the idea of an expectations matrix? Okay? Fairly straightforward. What we want to do is add some clarity to these big vocabulary words and provide some really specific examples of what those look like. And they do all of these things. They might actually identify those unknown rules, those norms, and actually make them really clear so everybody knows what they are. And the challenge of that, of course, is when we don't define things clearly, we run into trouble. All right. So what I'd like for us to do is you have an expectations matrix here. This is a high school matrix. I'd like you to take a look at it. There may have been a couple of things that I changed on this, but at least 90% of it is exactly the same as a real one. And what I'd like you to do is do two things. Number one is if you need to take a break right now, you can step out and come back, and hopefully you remember where Ashley said the restrooms were. I believe they are down this aisle and down that aisle. If you're not doing that, or when you come in, just take a look here and just have some wonderings. Identify something on here that you're thinking, I wonder about that. I don't know the school, I don't know the students, I don't know the families, but I would question whether these might lead us down the path that we don't want to go on. So what I'm going to do is if we're going to include this with a break and do this, we're going to come back in 10 minutes and just take a look. You can do this by yourself. You can do it with a partner and see what you find. Okay? And begin. Okay, if you are ready to come back, I want you to say, I'm good. All right. So when I left you last, I would ask you to do something to look at this matrix. And I want you to look for hidden biases, but I also, in the same time, some of the biases that we start thinking about, maybe not just culture, but also how student-centered our language is, as opposed to being adult-centered. So take a look and come here. So, unfortunately, I changed this a little bit ago. So there's some things that you might point out that are things that I deliberately changed, and there's some that might still be there for the school. But think of this as not these are evil people, but more like, this would be something if I was coaching this school, or if I was the team lead and the subcommittee had brought the matrix in, what would be ones that I'd want to ask a few questions about? So who's got one? Please. Yeah? So I believe both of those were not ones that I changed, but are ones that I would have some of those same questions about. And it's really, really interesting. The eat your own food and do not share with others, some of you can probably figure out, would clearly violate some community norms that some of our students and families might have. Although there are some times when people say, you know what, with allergies that we have, some students might feel compelled very strongly to give away some of their food to other people who are asking them to have them. And so what I would say with that is it is worth a conversation. It is not none of these are going to be absolutely, this is terrible, let's ditch it, or no, we really need to keep this one. But it's worth having the conversation, because if you're going to have a rule that you know, and I think just being aware of it is useful, that conflicts with some of your students' and families' values, you need to be explicit about it and teach the why. Because sharing food is something that, for some people, is the ultimate sign of respect. And so if we're going to say, we're going to ask you not to do that, we better really clearly describe it. And when students share food, we better not come in as our mall cop and be like, hey, we told you not to share food, but more of a, hey, remember, this is why we're doing this, and I'm sorry, I'm going to have to ask you to do that. I would probably encourage people to question how harshly they need to put that in there. If it's sort of, we don't want kids to be coerced to do it, that's fine. If we're going to do something with allergies, sometimes there are other ways of doing it. My son has really severe food allergies, and so he's at a different table, and that means that the people at that table eat the things that he's not deathly allergic to, and that works out all right. And then people can share all around, and he can share if he's sharing something as long as it's non-allergenic. And so there's ways of doing that. Okay, I spent way too much time on that example, but thank you. What else? Please. Eye contact, yeah. So eye contact is going to be one of those classic ones of, is that disrespectful or respectful? And you probably know that there are some families that would teach, and maybe it's a norm that people don't even know about, but is there, that looking somebody in the eye, especially when you are being corrected, would be very disrespectful. And one of the things that we do in early childhood settings is we do a lot, the matrix is almost entirely for the adults in the building, and it is not a teaching tool for the students. It's just to keep all of us on the same page, because this is far too many words, and we need to see, we need to be able to watch it happen. We need to have photos of students doing it as opposed to putting something up there. So yeah, thank you. I'm going to lay out one more thing up here. It is, so this is a high school, so of course they've got their pride on here. That's not an uncommon one. I am personally not a huge fan of excellence in there. One of them is it's actually pretty hard to do excellence here without being redundant with some of these other ones. But what about if you really want pride, what about adding empathy? That one would be one that's not generally, that doesn't generally fit in a matrix, but it actually fits really, really well. It's not often included, but fits really, really well for something that we want to see students showing to each other, to adults, adults to students, and so on. All right. I'm going to show you an example here of a middle school that had, I believe they had some old expectations that they felt like they didn't like particularly well and didn't match. I think it was just be safe, be respectful, and be responsible. This is in inner city Hampton, Virginia, a historically high poverty, pretty tough neighborhood. And what they decided to do is they said, let's change things up a little bit. Let's use some words that students are using, and what they decided is their expectations, they called them swag. Anybody familiar with swag? Swagger, right? It's not the stuff you get at a conference. It's the so swagger is being kind of boastful or prideful about what you do, right? So that in of itself might not actually be a bad thing. We might say, you know, we could actually turn that positive if we identify to students how what are the things that they ought to be boastful or prideful about. So they said, here's how you show swag at this school. Safety first, work together respectfully, accept responsibility. And then this fourth one is pretty cool. The fourth one, guide me, is actually what the adults specifically in the building will do to support the students. So the matrix applies to everyone, but here is how the adults are going to help. Teachers will stand by bathrooms to monitor noise and behavior from the hallway. Teachers will walk students into the cafeteria, right? Teachers will monitor students by being at their doors during passing periods. That's kind of a neat little thing to include in here. When you got expectations, you might want to have them across multiple languages of the school. That's a good idea. Here's one in English and Spanish. Here is a school in Lame Deer, Montana, and these are all Dene words that fits with check in, check out. So here's your single tier 2 example that you've got, Pat. And that's about it. Okay, so here's what I'd like you to do. You have in your packet a worksheet to walk through about expectations in a school. So if you have access to expectations and a matrix for a school that you work with, or the one school that you work with, or the one school that you work in, or a sample, I want you to say, got it, okay? Okay. I'm hearing a little bit. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through what this looks like, but we're not actually going to do the activity right here because I want to make sure that everybody's got a little something to work with here. So what I want you to do is actually walk through here, and I'm just going to walk you through how to do it, and then you might be able to take it back or think about how to specifically examine those expectations. So what you do is you got your school, you got your date, and then you list out what are the established school-wide expectations or values if you have any of those. Okay? So right up here, we've got this. And then question number 2, right below the expectations, is a very interesting question that sometimes we don't think through. When and how were they developed? Who was at the table when they were developed? And who provided input? And for many people, their expectations and matrices looked a little bit like this. Right? We sent a few people to a 2-day training. They went and they got their matrices. They spent all this time doing it, and then they came back and said, lo and behold, these are our expectations and they are good. Right? And so that can work well if that group has the trust and familiarity with the building and knows the students and maybe even reflects the student body. But it might not if that group doesn't necessarily have the buy-in from all staff to do it, doesn't necessarily know families and their cultures and so on. And so that's the chance for us to say, maybe we take the matrix that we have right now that we built a few years ago and look at it as a really good first draft that we may want to keep parts of and may want to think a little bit more closely about other ones. That is easier if you don't already have these shirts, formats, gigantic posters, things everywhere. But it might be worth looking at. And some of these things are easier to fix than others. So here are a few things that I want you to think about that you could do. And you can ask them, and it's possible that those people who went up to the mountain and came down with the expectations did a wonderful job with it. So number 1, are they positively stated what to do instead of what not to do? Right? Are they broad? Are they small in number? Are they memorable? Those all sound like classic critical features of PBIS, expectations. But here's some ones that sometimes people don't always look at. Apply to both students and adults. Adults in the school, commit to modeling them. That means that, yes, our cell phone policy also relates to the adults in the building, right? We are modeling for students. And the best way to have a negative school climate is to ask students to do things and have us regularly break the rules that we are asking students to do. And when we talk about actually modeling them, that's highlighting, it's not that the rules are for you and we've got a different set of rules. It's the rules are for you and you're only going to do it if we actually commit to showing that they're actually useful. We might ask if they reflect community values or principles. We might also ask if they represent universal core life skills. So my wife teaches at a school. She just went to it. She was not part of the expectations as they were built. And it is be safe, be respectful, and follow all adult directions. What do you think about that? We were just talking about that. Is that a life skill? We do want students to be safe. I think we do want the students and adults to be safe. We want them to be respectful. But do we want them to follow all adults' directions all the time? No, right? Follow ones, but sometimes following a direction is not going to keep me safe and is not going to keep me respectful, right? I don't remember what her other R is. I better find out. So she's really, really upset, but she's also not walking in being like, that last one has got to go, right? She's waiting for the time to step in and say, who else at the table is sort of wondering about this one and is a little uncomfortable about what this one looks like? You know, because there may be a culture of, you know what, that's the only way we're going to do it is if it's one of the three. And I wonder a little bit about that one. And then also post it in multiple languages around the school. So here are a couple reflection questions, especially if you are in a high school, thinking about it, moving your expectations from commands to values might be a nicer thing. Instead of do this, it's show respect, right? Respect is one of our values, is a little different from saying be respectful, right? Can you hear that? Like, it's a subtle difference, but I think it's there for some people. If it doesn't work for your group, that's fine. And then that's just a little open-ended. How might you revise your expectations to better reflect your school's values? Sometimes it's going to be easier for you to change stuff within a matrix than it is to change the school expectations. And that's okay, but I mean, it's all about sort of regular committing to continuous improvement that we have. All right. Next part about it is looking at your matrix. And this is what we just did with the high school one, so that's why I wanted to give you a sense, because not everybody brings all of theirs in here. Here are critical features for a school-wide teaching matrix. Has the expectations and settings. Specific examples are positively stated. I am not a person who says you shall never have a no in there, but I think 9 times out of 10 you can revise it so that it works really, really well. People say, well, we have a no gum rule. Great. Throw your gum away before you walk in, and here's the gum trash can. Yep, that's actually far more specific, because some kids are going to say, no gum, okay, boop, done, no gum, right? Oops, that was exactly what we didn't want. Okay, hats off before you go in the classroom. Don't get me started about hats. I'm pretty anti-no hats, personally. I might have some personal feelings about it. I only wore hats when I was in high school and I had a bad hair day. And so having to take off my hat, being a middle schooler or a high schooler and having messed up hair, that's really awkward, But some of you are going to say, you know what, we all got together and we all think hats come off. It's like, okay. Sometimes people will say things like, oh, if people are wearing hats, then I can't see where they're looking. So you might say hats off for tests. That might be a way to get around that. And then everybody knows that, okay, test tomorrow. Remember, get up early and do your hair well. Okay. And so we've got lots of things here. One of the things that we want to do is we want to have few examples in here. Your expectations matrix, remember we don't want a giant list of no's for our expectations lists and our matrices. We also don't want an enormous list of yeses. What these are supposed to do is simply teach the vocabulary word of integrity and show us specific examples across, not show every single possible way that you could show integrity. That's not good. The other thing I really like here is, I don't know if I've got on this list here. I'm a really big fan when you start cutting things out to get rid of the dead person. Everybody know the dead person rule? Dead person rule is if a dead person can do it, it's not a good thing for your matrix. Okay? They should all be actively showing what integrity is, not just passively not being unintegritous. I don't know what that word is. I mean, disrespectful, respect? Okay, let's see if we can figure that out. The other thing that we start to ask is when we start looking at our school data and we compare it to our matrix, we want to ask ourselves, have we defined behavior that is different as wrong, when really it's just something that is a little bit unfamiliar to us? So that's one of the things that we want to be careful for, especially if these are behaviors that are acceptable out of school, but just not in school. So the sharing food is a pretty good example. We can do it, but we've got to be really clear with students. We're not saying that you should never share food, but here's the reason why in the cafeteria, or if that's how you're going to roll with it. And so then there's an action plan that goes from that. One of the things that I really do recommend is start thinking about who's at the table, either for when they're being made, and then also who's at the table for when they're being re-examined and looked at. And I'll give you a few activities for how to connect in that way. All right. So you get a chance to revise your expectations or revise your matrix and move forward with it. All right. So I'm going to move on to a question here for you. And it's this one. And I'm going to ask you to shout out your answers if it's all right. In one or two, or if you want to add 3 words and buck my rules, that's okay. I did. Thank you. Enunciation is really, really important, right? That's for this afternoon. This morning, still kind of keep it together. Thank you. So how do you think your students would describe your school behavior systems? Mm-hmm. Lame. Uh-huh. Yeah, we'll talk about that. Well, I think one of the things that's a really good question is if you're thinking, I've never thought about that, then that is a pretty good cue to ask your students what they think about the school behavior systems. I'm fond of this saying, nothing about us without us. That's right. We're building systems for students. It would be pretty good if we got them on board with how we're doing it, because they might be able to give us some pretty good ideas. I know I talked about Anita Archer's one of my favorite teachers. Kurt Hahn is one of my other favorite teachers, and I love this quotation from him. There are 3 ways of trying to win the young. There is persuasion, there is compulsion, and there is attraction. You can preach at them, that is a hook without a worm. You can say you must volunteer, and that is the devil. And you can tell them you are needed, and that hardly ever fails. I will tell you that if you ask students to join in helping make your school behavior systems work better, they will jump in at the opportunity at just about any grade level you've got. So I'm going to give you a few examples of how to do that. I'm a big fan of getting student input from some kind of survey, and I'm going to share with you one that we've built that I really like, probably because we built it, but it's free and you can use it out there. It is the Stakeholder Input and Satisfaction Survey, or the SIS. We have an elementary version, we have a secondary version, we have a staff version, and we have a family version. So there are 4 of those. If any of you are using PBIS assessment or PBIS apps to do some of the fidelity of implementation surveys, you could ask your coordinator to get set up with our field testing site, because this one is new and just getting rolled out. And so if you have no idea what that is, but you do know what PBIS apps is or PBIS assessment is, just ask me and I'm happy to connect you with how to do that. But here it is. You could do this on paper, or it is intended to be an anonymous online survey. So it can be done just like, if any of you are familiar with the self-assessment survey, the SAS. You just get an anonymous link and people can use it. You could take students down to the computer lab and do it, have them do it on their own. Many students have mobile phones anyway, so they could just do it then. You could find some time to do it. But I'm going to highlight some of the parts of it that I really like. There's some demographic information that you can ask, and then you can disaggregate all of your scores by that. Here is a question, just as we were talking about the expectations. Number 1, do you know how your teachers want you to behave at school? What are the expectations? So you can include a little knowledge test and actually just look at the open-ended questions. One of the things I think that you're starting to see is that it's not just a school climate survey of rating on a scale of 1 through a scale of not at all to always, all the time. It's really intended to get some open-ended responses. Are the expectations, this is the secondary version, are the expectations meaningful or important to you, yes or no? If not, what do you think they should be? Are the expectations the same as they are in your home? If not, what's different at school? Starting to get some of those differences there. A few other ones. Acknowledgement. We were talking about that as something really key. In the last week, did you see somebody else get acknowledged or rewarded for doing things the right way? Did they see you doing that? And then you can look at differences across groups. If you did, were you rewarded or praised in ways that were meaningful or important to you? If not, how could it be more meaningful? Why wouldn't we want to ask that, right? Some other ones. A few yes/no questions about respect. Are students at your school respectful to other students? Are students at your school respectful to teachers? Are teachers at your school respectful to students? And then look at this one. Are teachers at your school respectful to other teachers? They're always watching us, right? They're always looking for cues about how to interact. And if they see adults in the building trashing each other, they're going to fall right in on that one. And then we've got some other ones here. I'll go right here. Here's some information, some open-ended ones. The biggest problem with behavior in my school is, one thing teachers and staff could do better is, one thing teachers and staff are doing in my school that they should keep doing is, and then one thing I wish my teachers knew about me is. A lot of people ask that as an anonymous question of students, and some of the stuff you get is really, really wonderful, and some of it is stuff that'll break your heart, but fairly important to know. Sometimes people will also move a little bit farther and say, can students co-create the rules in our classroom? And so sometimes people call this a classroom constitution activity, where students are all here and they're signing up on the board, their names to it, and everybody joins in, although it's usually not everybody joins in, but just some people share. There are even some great lesson plans you can find, but basically you're sitting in the classroom and asking students to come up with what should the rules be, what are the expectations, what should those be, and then everybody signs it at the bottom. So here is an example. You can find about 1 billion out there. I'm going to ask you to read my mind for a little bit. I'm not a very big fan of this way of doing this activity. Why do you think I am not a big fan of doing this activity in this way? It's not that I refuse to give control to students. Although that, fair enough. What are some of the concerns? Please. And so one of the things that you're talking through is one of the challenges of having a negatively stated expectation is it only tells you one thing. It doesn't say what to do when you're upset with somebody, how to handle that. Yeah. What else? Please. Yeah, so what's the deal with the expectation that you sign it? That is one of the big things that bothers me. But what do you think? What about for you? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a couple parts of it. As number one, in general, when you're asking students to generate rules, there's probably 5 to 7 kids who are really making this, and then a bunch of other kids who are just sitting there, right? But the other part that you said about making people sign it, my main fear, I'm not so anti making people sign it. What I'm against is what people often are tempted to do when kids sign a constitution, which is what? Fritz has got your hand on that. Is that your name? Is that your name there? Did you just sign your name to that? Are you a liar? You put your name to this, right? And it's like, well, you had a rough day and you did not behave, And so what it does is it tempts people to use this intervention of like, you need to have integrity with the way you sign stuff. Yeah, I have some challenges with that. I have some challenges with every classroom having their own set of 7 to 45 different rules that you will find, right? But there are ways of doing this that works a little bit better. So here's an example here where they said, we'll take these school-wide expectations, but we're going to fill in for the classroom specific examples in the matrix, and then we'll curate them a little bit. I'm going to take all of the ideas that you have, and I'm not going to use all of them, but I'm going to use them, and they're going to end up showing up in your words there. They signed. That's okay. I'm not that angry with it. But yeah, so students generate examples within the school-wide expectations, so we have the language of the expectations to use without. Sometimes people will supplement with a Bill of Rights activity. This is a little more common in middle school and high school. We're actually teaching social skills about what is the Bill of Rights. It's kind of an interesting thing to be able to talk about, who has rights to do what and when do your rights infringe on others. So if you want to do that as a lesson that aligns with the curriculum, I could say that could work and that could supplement a classroom matrix. But there are lots of other ways to get student voice that work a whole lot better than that activity done that way. For example, here's an activity that I love to do is take your school-wide matrix and take everything in the middle and ask students to fill it in. And it is great. There's two things that it does. Number one is you start looking for where are the places where students can't write something in. And if it's a specific example, we might not know how to respect others in the hallway. It's, wow, this is great information for a booster lesson. It might also be that they can't go all the way across for one of the expectations that they have. And that's starting getting you to, especially if you've got like 5 or 6 school-wide expectations, it's like, maybe we've got a little bit of overlap. We tried to be a little too cutesy with our logo. We made it into eagles, but then we had 2 E's and only one of the E made sense. And so it makes sense for you to kind of like think about it that way. But the other thing that's really good is you can actually get students will give much better examples than we would actually do. So I think that one works well. And then here's one, I like this one, particularly for middle school students and for high school students. I stole this from colleagues in the Netherlands, and it's called the Rules Gallery Walk. There are a few different ways of doing it, but I'll give you the general idea, is you ask students to go around the school property in the building and around, and ask them basically to document, but it's usually taking pictures of every rule they can find. Okay? Every rule they can find. And then what you do is you take them, I actually have the steps on here, and post them in a big area, like the gym or the cafeteria. Put some flip chart paper below so you got a picture of the rule, and ask students to go around and answer a few questions. And I've got a few questions here. I would not do all of them. I think maybe like 3 questions would be good, but here are some of them. Is the rule positively stated? What is the purpose of the rule? What is the underlying value that this rule promotes? Sometimes what we find is the underlying value that this rule promotes is you kids are sometimes really annoying and get in the way of my job, which is to teach you things. So stop doing annoying things. Is this rule necessary? Does this rule fit within any of our school-wide expectations? Could we actually have that fit underneath instead of just having random rules all over the place? And then you take those results and you change what you do. Sometimes people find that their school signage is very positive, but their district signage, the required signs around, are super duper negative. Let me give you an example here. Here's a sign. This is in a school district not to be named, but the name is at the bottom. It's a district sign in every high school. How do you think a student would feel about this? How do you think a student would react to it? If you look really, really closely, somebody did react to it, and you can't read it, but it has something to do with what Tara said before. It said, be fruitful and multiply to the law. Another thing that I really, really like is to build a student advisory board that is specifically designed to get input from students from marginalized groups. Okay? So they might not be people who are going to be on the team all of the time, but a group who's specifically approached to say, hey, we want you to provide really good input into our school systems, and we're going to come to you from time to time. We're going to ask you to look at our matrix. We're going to ask you to review the lesson plans. We're going to ask you to identify what are some challenges that we run into and get that input and highlight back to them. There's a great, if anybody has heard or read, Chris Emdin has a book. I usually call it the best book that you would be most embarrassed to have on your shelf. I think it's called For White People Who Teach in the Hood and All the Rest of Y'all Too. And it's actually, he's got this really, really great 7-step process for doing an equity advisory board, either in the classroom or in the school. That's really, really good and lays out how to do that and really get some good student voice in there, particularly for the ones who we're most concerned about. And then, of course, getting family input. So what I'm going to do, obviously we've got the family survey that you could use. You could do your typical ones. One of the things that we know is that if we send a family survey out, who's going to respond to it? Either 0 or all the people who have plenty of voice anyways, right? You know your PTO president is going to respond to it. You know the people who are always in the school volunteering, who might swing by the principal's office, are going to respond to it. But other people aren't. So there's lots of ways to do this, and I think there's some fun ways to do it that work really well and are actually pretty quick. I'm a big fan of using existing school events. So if you've got your back to school night, the wording on this is going to be a little small, but I'm going to kind of talk you through it and see what it looks like. This was a school that we were working with in a local district where they wanted to get family input on the school-wide expectations. So here's what they did. They asked, they had a picture, and I'll show you, well, I'll just stick it up here. They had a picture of a kid's outline, and they asked every family member who came in to take a sticky and write one word that is important to you, that you want your kid to have left school having learned, and stick it on this kid somewhere. And then what they did is they distilled that down to, and actually changed their expectations based on that. Really easy to do, really straightforward. It was hardly different from what the school had, but the exact words were a little bit different, and they were able to share back what that looked like. Here's one in particular where they said, you know, here we want to actually lay this out a little bit differently. Here are some values that we came up with as a school climate team. Please check which ones you think are most important to you. So a little bit less of a free-form generation and a little bit more constricted, which has its pros and cons to it, but probably a little bit easier to incorporate in what things are really important for you. The other one that I really like is parent conference time. We are pretty used to thinking about, okay, we got to make this quick. I got a few minutes per kid. I'm getting the kid to run it, so the adults are not involved in it. I want to think about, is there something that you could do if you've got most, not every family member, but if you've got most family members, what would be one question that you would ask all of your staff or all of your teachers to ask those family members? What would it be? So take just a second and think about that. What would be a question that you'd really want at least to be asked of every family member of every kid in your school? Great, please.
Does your kid come home
Yeah. What you're what you're getting. So the question was, does your kid come home happy, or is your kid happy, or does your kid enjoy school, or something like that? But what I liked about it is you described it not like does she or he like that, but come home happy, right? Or is happy to go there, because we know if they're unhappy to be there, they might do some things to not be there, right? And we'd want to know a little bit about that. So that's a nice little temperature-taking one. What else? Does your child feel respected? Some good questions. What does your child say about school? Yeah, what do they share about school? If they're like my kids, they don't share anything about school. Here's some, oh, please, one more, and then I'll show you a list, too.
Do you feel like you can be honest about the input that you need to give to us?
Ah,
Honestly, if you ask all of those questions, they may, yeah, he's happy, if they don't feel like they can help you. Like if I asked you an honest question, you could be honest about it.
yeah, I'll get to a little strategy for that in a moment, too, for that. But here's some that people have generated with us when I've asked this question. What is something great about your child? Not what are your kids' strengths, what is something great about them? I really like that one. What are some goals for your child for this year? Sometimes you find that they are really, really strong on academics. Sometimes they're strong on social emotional growth. Maybe how would you like me to get a hold of you? Here's one that's kind of interesting. What's a strategy you use to help your child back on track if needed? That might not be, if I was only going to ask one question, that might set the slightly wrong tone if that was the one I was going to ask. But boy. And then to get with your question about do you feel comfortable doing it, it's also adding in opportunities for anonymous feedback and ones that don't look like this. That's a shredder if you haven't figured it out. But if you were to say, and that's one of the things that's really hard, you do want to get a sense of do families trust you, but then the question of sort of like do you trust us is also pretty intense to ask. So to have a suggestion box, but with a little bit of a tweak, every family gets a slip in the suggestion box handed to them and say, please, I would really like you to put anything you want on here on your way out the door. Does that feel a little different than there's a comment box if you want to leave an anonymous note? It's big. I think it's giving that agency for anonymous input that I think is really, really big. And then we've got the family survey as well. There's some other ways of doing it. There is in the field guide a few questions about asking about the school matrix. So you could do that, get a little bit more input, get a little bit more voice at the table for that. And so given what you see here, let me ask you real quick. What would be something that you would, what's something that you might take with you and say, yeah, I kind of like that one? What are your thoughts? Mm-hmm. And that part is a philosophy. And then there's also what's the strategy that shows, because it's easy to have, some people take it really to heart, and some people it becomes the empty words. Like, yeah, if you have any input on how we discipline your kid, let me know. We'll totally do it, yeah. We're with you. We're partnering with you. Absolutely. And it takes, especially with families, it takes a little bit of a leap, because just about 90% of everything we do that is about family engagement is about how can you families do stuff that I want you to do, not how can we actually share the load together. Absolutely. So you're saying that somebody's greeting them with the comment slip and saying, as you're waiting to go in, here is the box. We would love for you to show up without it in there. If you want to give it directly to your teacher, you could do that too, but our expectation is that you do it anonymously. And heck, you're going to be sitting here for a couple minutes anyways, so might as well take that on. Yeah, and then when you're done, you split, for sure. All right. So the last thing we're going to do, I don't say last, the last big section of the day is looking about how we do our teaching and how we do our instruction. I'm going to give you a few tips and strategies and ideas for making our way through that. Of course, we know that we need to have a plan for teaching our expectations at the beginning of the year and then boosters throughout the year, looking at our data to identify when we want to re-up those. We want to teach them exactly where they are. So I'm fond of telling this story. When I was doing student teaching, the principal had this announcement that kids were hurting themselves on the playground, and there were too many skinned knees from kids running and falling on the blacktop. And so we wanted a rule of no running on the blacktop because too many kids were falling down. They could run it. There was a little bit of blacktop, and then there was tons of grass outside, so it wasn't like super evil. And so I'm like, I'm a good teacher. I know how to do this. I am going to teach it. Number one, I'm going to teach it positively, and number two, I'm going to make this really engaging with lots of opportunities to respond. So I have my kids in. These are elementary resource, so they're between grades 2 and 5. We sit down. I'm like, all right, we have this problem that's going on. Everyone's getting hurt, and so we're going to make a little bit of a change. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to repeat after me. When I say we are on the blacktop, what do we do? So it's walk. So when we're on blacktop, what do we do? You can be my students here. Oh, thank you. And when you're on the grass, what can you do? Oh, yeah, you guys are really good at this. We do a little bit of practice, a little bit of role play. Oh, this is awesome. I made a little fake, blacktop in my classroom and then grass. And I'm super excited. The principal is standing out there. Time for recess. So I say, all right, let's do this. What happens? They run. And I'm like, oh my God, the principal's out there. I run after them. And I'm like, what are you doing? And a few kids turned around and they looked and they're like, oh. And if I had done that exact lesson 20 feet away, it would have worked perfectly. So you got to teach it where it's happening. That's one of the things that's really, really key. And you got to teach. You want to be able to teach students the bright line between what's okay and what is unwanted. So you take your matrix, you take all of your specific examples, and those go straight into your lesson plans that you have. So you just build off of that. The examples are there for you because the matrix is for us for teaching, not for us just sticking on the wall and saying, now you've learned it, right? So we're actually out there. Here is a lesson on expectations in the, what do you think? Hallway, of course. That's where it's happening. Here's his lesson plan for doing it. Great. Okay, so I'm going to show you, I'm going to give you a few examples of what this might look like, a little bit more involving students in our teaching and a little bit more of asking ourselves some questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you an activity called the personal matrix. And what I want to do is I want to introduce this to you, and I want to have you get a little bit of a sense of it. We're not going to go all the way through this, but I'm going to describe how you would do this so you've got a little bit of a sense. So what you do is this is one that you actually do with students. And you do it you can do it in your classroom is a pretty good spot to do it. So think about doing this with teachers, with the students in all the classroom. And I could describe it, but I think a better thing to do is me just show you what it looks like. So here is the worksheet for a personal matrix. You've got your expectations here. Here's a school where their expectations are be safe, be respectful, be responsible. They're working for them. They fit fine. They already made the doormats when you come in, so they're not going to change those. They painted the mural. And here are their specific examples of what it looks like at school. And then what you see is there's two more columns. There's at home and there's in my neighborhood. And those ones are all blank. So here's how it works. Everybody's personal matrix looks a little bit different. Okay? And what I recommend that people do, is we've got a whole set of steps, and like I said, I'll get you the slides so you have them and they'll be available to you. You actually introduce this, ask students to do it, but one of the things that I like for doing, if you're going to do this school-wide, is have the adults do it first. And so that's this handout right here is a personal matrix that has the school-wide expectations, so you would write those in. And you could actually ask the adults to also write in what it looks like at school, and you could kind of do that blank matrix activity with the adults in the building. But have them fill it out too. How is school different from home? How is school different from when I'm hanging out with my friends? Because if you do it, I think you get a little bit more of a sense of what it looks like. But what I'm going to have you do here is just take a look. Here is a filled out personal matrix from a student. This student can write in perfect Comic Sans. So here's the school expectations here. And then we've got at home and in my neighborhood. And if this is too small for you to look at, then I've got something really small but close up to you, which is the back page right here. And it's the exact same sheets in here. What I'd like for you to do is take a look at this, kind of like what we did with the matrix activity before, and see some things that kind of pop out for you. What are some things that you notice and that you see? So we'll just spend 2 minutes doing that. Gotcha. Okay, so there's 2 things that I want to unpack from that, because that is spot on. Number one is you said from looking at this expectation right here of be safe, there is some community violence that is present in this child's life that might not be present in mine and might not be present in other child's in my classroom's lives. But there is a lot of ways that this child has learned to be safe in the neighborhood. And the other thing you identified, which is wonderful, because sometimes what this ends up being, and this is why I think it's really useful for you to do the personal matrix with staff before you have people do it with the students, is sometimes it turns into this, you get in this what's called a deficit thinking approach, where you say, oh my gosh, there are no community assets, this kid lives in poverty, oh poor this kid. It is just bereft of values. They don't have any role models showing them. But you identified as, wow, this kid has figured out how to move across environments that have really different rules for being safe. And that's something that's really, really interesting for us to know, and something for us to be proud of this kid for being able to do. Sure. Thank you. What else? Yeah. So one of the things that you're highlighting is with these big differences across, when we see unwanted behavior at school, we could say, oh, that kid is being defiant and that kid is a jerk and that kid is poor and this kid is not learning anything. Or you could say, this kid has a totally different set of rules, and maybe what we're seeing is not willful defiance, but is actually just misapplication of the norms across settings, right? Inappropriate generalization. And so if you know a little bit about, you might be able to do that. And the description that sometimes I've heard people talk about is when you see unwanted behavior, be curious, not furious. Try to figure out, okay, what's going on here? That this doesn't appear to be random. Let me figure out a little bit more about it. And so what you were describing is, maybe it's not that this kid is unsafe, it's just that we haven't been really clear about what we want in school, and it's so different from that. So, a nice little example here is we ask at school, if there is a problem, you need to tell an adult. This kid is telling us, that if I were to do that at other places, that would be the exact opposite of how to be safe, right? Mind your own business. Look away. If you're not involved in it, then don't move forward, right? But the other part of this is also, if I get challenged, I'm going to have to stick up for myself. And even if it doesn't go well for me, I'm preventing it from happening the next time, right? I'm going to get beat up once, but I'm going to show that I can throw a few punches, and then that way that person's going to think a little bit, think twice before doing that. Those are some of the rules out there, right? But they go totally against what we're asking over here. Anything else? Bridget? Yeah. So your first point that you were noting was there is a qualitative, there's a categorical difference in that, especially in responsible, it is all about individualism. It is all about being my best. It is about doing my share, and that's it. But this one over here is share success for credit, help your family out first, much more of a communal approach. And so what you did is you identified not a like, oh, these kids don't care about their kids learning. These families don't care about these kids learning. It's, oh my gosh, there's a different priority of the values in there. And that our school values so much prioritize individual achievement and individual accomplishment, and that's really different. And what you're doing there is you're not taking a deficit approach of saying, oh yeah, no, these people aren't teaching a strong work ethic. You're saying there is a different set of rules. There are different norms out there. Being totally individualistic will not actually help this kid, not only at home, but maybe also in school and in career and in work and in post-secondary and all of those things moving forward. That we may want to capitalize on some of those family things. Sure, please. Yeah, so think about this one here. Help your family out first literally means help yourself out second. And so what that means is if I've got to get my little brother off to school and make sure that he catches his bus, it might mean I'm tardy, right? Which looks bad on me over here. It looks like I'm being irresponsible, but we start learning a little bit about how, oh my gosh, that person actually got the little brother on school on time and got to school almost on time. That's pretty darn responsible, right? Yeah. So it gives us an opportunity to learn a little bit more. The other thing that it does is it gives us, I'm going to click through a few of these things here. So we get to asking ourselves where we see those big differences, okay? Where there are those big gaps between school and home. We're going to ask ourselves, are those differences necessary for positive student development? And there's going to be a couple of answers on here. It could be that we're saying, no, our school rules are just because that's the way school is supposed to be, but it isn't actually useful. So that's what, Bridget, you were saying about let's change things a little bit to make it a little bit more focusing on teaching group skills, teaching more interdependence rather than independence. But there might also be times when we say, you know what, for safety, and because every kid's personal matrix will literally be different because every kid has different environments, we can't make one matrix that matches everybody. That's impossible. Totally impossible. And so what we do is we identify when we are asking students to do something different than in the 18 hours a day they're not in school, we just say, hey, in school, we got some different rules, and I know it might be a little different from what you're used to. You might ask the question instead of saying, this is not the way that you do it, because that might also lead to some stereotyping. And we identify that if a student is practicing it a totally different way because it works for them 18 hours a day, then they might slip up for those 6 hours a day that they're in your school. And we treat that as an opportunity to make a mistake, just like we would with an academic thing. right? Yeah, so here's the way to do that, and I'm glad you brought that up. In that case, you have students write their names on it. You have them turn them all in. You actually look as a group and do this as a staff activity, and then you give them back to the students. Or sometimes you copy them and give them back. And what you know with a Tier 1 approach is that just identifying it for students and us changing our systems a little bit is going to help. And for some, it's like, oh, I need to go look at that matrix and see what's up. I need to be curious, not furious there. And that's how it's going to work. And you'll see as I went through some of the things that I skipped over are ways to prevent some common challenges. Asking people about surprises that they saw. Asking people to look for positive values as opposed to only looking at deficits is important. And yeah, just to prove that we actually do it, here's one that's not in Perfect Comic Sans that's useful. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but somebody did just yell that out, no cops. So here's a kid who has figured out that it is unsafe when police officers are around and I need to get out of there. And that might be different from my experience or your experience, or it might be similar too. But this kid has figured something out that way. Don't read too much of that, it'll break your heart. Okay. So I'm going to go through a few more ways about teaching the lessons. That's still a little bit more about defining, moving them through, but it is actually a lesson, a way to involve it with students. Clearly, involving students in planning and teaching lessons is useful, and I'm going to just give you, if you haven't already figured that out, a couple little prompts. There's a great... oh, no, that's my next slide. So having students up there doing it will vastly reduce the comment system as lame, because they got those students up there. And who do you want to pick to teach the lessons? What do you think? Shout it out. Students, yes? Do you want it to be all the popular kids? You want a good mix of students. There's a really interesting research study looking at student-led anti-bullying lessons. What these researchers did is they had two approaches for who they were going to identify to teach the lessons. They asked students to do these ratings. One was they asked all of the popular kids in the school to teach the anti-bullying lessons. And the other one, they asked the kids who everybody in the school knew to teach the lessons, those with lots of social ties. Can you guess which one was more effective? The ones who everybody knew. Yeah. Here's a great video. I'm not going to show it because you'll see it on YouTube. You'll get the handouts. I'll show you another video in a minute. This is especially important when you're looking at prevention of bullying. So you can go onto pbis.org and get both an elementary school, a middle school, and there's also another version beyond that. I don't think I have a picture of that one, called Expect Respect, which is for middle and high school students. It's a little bit more developmentally appropriate. But for the elementary and middle school version, there's this idea of, number one, you can only build this if you've got a good school-wide system. You can't just have one canned anti-bullying system and expect it to work. Then the other thing is you teach students skills to respond to disrespectful or unsafe behavior. You don't say this is what you do to a bully. You don't say this is what you do for when bullying happens to you. You simply teach something universal that says if you don't feel safe and somebody is doing that to you, here's what you do. A clear signal to stop, to tell that person who is teasing you or bothering you to stop. Next one, if that doesn't work, to walk away. The third one is to go tell an adult if that person keeps bothering you. One of the things that's really, really important is we want to encourage students to do this on their own, to use the skills. But when they come to an adult and say, hey, I'm getting bullied, one of the things that we figured out early on is that a lot of times the people who was often recess monitors, they would be like really, really doing a fidelity check. They're like, did you tell him to stop? Did you walk away? Instead of thank you for telling me. I'm sorry that happened. Let's figure out a way to do it. Can I ask you a couple questions about how it happened? Not sort of like, you did it wrong. I don't care about your feelings. We don't want that. But it's pretty easy to see that if you're teaching students to do something with each other, they'd better know that it's something that people are going to use. Otherwise, it's useless. It's probably worse than useless. So a little example of this in a middle school that I was working with, what they decided to do was ask the students, what would be a signal? And most of the time, mostly in elementary school, hands up and stop. And what these middle school students said is that is not going to work for us. That nobody's going to do that. That's way too like, I am using my stop signal with you. Do you understand the discriminative stimulus? So instead, it was much more, they said, well, what would really happen? And so they said, what would be more useful, because especially teasing sort of sometimes starts general and then moves over, they would just say, too far. Too far. And that was it. They taught that. It worked really, really well. They had eighth grade students teach that to the rest of the school. They had a popular kid, a kid everybody knew, and a kid who was previously had challenges with bullying behavior himself, and taught that. And I think that was one of the really big buy-in components to it. And what you can see is this is from year to year. These are the rates of office referrals specifically for verbal bullying. This is the year before when they just had PBIS in place. The next one was after they used the student-led instructions there. Big drop, lower in every single month except for one of those. Okay. So I think the last thing I want to do with you is talk through an approach that you're probably quite familiar with, called using opportunities to respond, having students more actively engaged in their lessons, and often academic lessons. So an opportunity to respond is simply a teacher behavior that gets a student response. And there are some that are a little bit more academic focused and some are a little bit less so. So most of you are probably familiar with opportunities to respond, if you're educators. But why is it so important to have students responding in classrooms? What are some good reasons? I'm providing an opportunity to respond right now. Please. Encourages other students to respond. When you respond, then somebody else is going to raise their hand and they're going to be a little bit more engaged. They're hearing a different voice in the classroom, so it ups the engagement and gets more students participating. Sure. What else? You may have noticed that I started with maybe a little bit of a safer one because there's more than one right answer. This is a good thing to be thinking about when you're providing opportunities to respond. What else? So we get more students. Students might learn more from other students, especially if we're really clear about whether it's correct or not quite, and they get that feedback. Then I hear from you. You say that. Absolutely. We actually have some good research that says it improves achievement as well. Students are a little bit more engaged in the lesson. Lots of good reasons. With more office referrals, more engagement, students get more feedback from us, but it also provides a great check for understanding for my instruction as well. So if somebody responds with something incorrect, then I know, hey, here's something I need to reteach that I wouldn't have had I not done that before. So here's the thing that's a little bit of a challenge. We have a good deal of research that says that the opportunities to respond to students are not equally spread out amongst our students. Who are the students who are less likely to get opportunities to respond? Well, actually, let me ask it this way. Who are the students who are more likely to get opportunities to respond, meaning they get called on, they raise their hand, they share with the class? You all have an idea in your head of who that kid is. What do you think? Sure. There's always that one person who is going to stick their hand up and give a reply. And thank you for that, Brooke. All right. How about English proficiency? Right? How about disability? How about likelihood that they get the answer right as opposed to wrong? How about that they most clearly put their hand up in the air? So, research says we are less likely to give to students who are lower achieving. We are less likely to give to students who are students of color, lower English proficiency, and also less likely to offer the responses on their own as opposed to being the one person who's always answering the question. So that is a little bit of a problem. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you, I'm just going to share a few different ways to do opportunities to respond. And what I'd like you to do is everybody stand up for a moment. Well, actually, stay standing. Yeah, get up and stay standing. Sorry. You are all like ready to go. Okay. What I want you to do is think in your head of a specific strategy that you might use to increase students' opportunity to respond. Okay? You've got it in your head. Think about it. Does everybody have a strategy? Okay, here's what I'd like you to do. I would like somebody to shout out what that is, and if it is the one that is in your head, I want you to sit down, okay? Make sense? All right, so who wants to go ahead? You can just yell it out. Think, pair, share. Excellent. Okay, so give students a little bit of think time. Then you talk with the neighbors, then you share it out. Much more likely to get a response than if I just ask a question cold turkey. Right? They've already thought through it a little bit. Maybe they've gotten to correct each other a little, get a little performance feedback when they do that. So think, pair, share. Wonderful. Okay, what else? Yell it out. Yeah, so using a technology system to have students actually provide responses up there. So Kahoot, okay. So you can, if you gave the example, you can sit down too. Okay, so that might also include using clickers, using any kind of personal response systems that you have. Okay, what else? Whiteboard. Student whiteboard. So every student gets a little whiteboard and they write down their answers on there. Excellent. Okay, what else? The what you said?
The random stick.
The random stick, the popsicle sticks that has every student's name on it. Great, and that way you know who you're getting it to and who you're not getting it to. Great. Okay, what else? Gallery walks. So having students walk around the room and answer questions in little groups. Great, and we talked about the rules gallery walk.
Sure.
What else? All right. Choral responding, so asking everybody to respond on cue. I've already had you do a little bit of choral responding. I did a little bit of that when I was talking about the lesson walk on the blacktop. Oh, we have last person standing. Gestures. Thumbs up. Give me a scale of 1 to 5, right? So I've been trying to pepper these throughout my time here. So what I'm going to do, I didn't even do this whole thing. Okay. So this is not what I'm going to go through, but here's a list from Anita Archer, one of my favorite teachers, on all of the different ways that we can get students to engage a little bit more. And she's got, if you go to this website right here, I believe not only can you get a handout about increasing opportunities to respond, but doing it with equity in mind. Because some of these, you're going to have a little bit more, some of them are going to increase equity, and some of them might actually have some challenges with equity. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you 4 easy ways to increase opportunities to respond. If you're not familiar with it, some of these are going to sound pretty familiar to you. Some of them might not. So one of the things that we might use is random calling. Okay? So I'm going to ask a question to the class. I'm going to wait 5 seconds so everybody has had a chance to think about it. And then I'm going to put one person on the spot and do that. And the waiting is really, really key because everybody's got it in their head. Everybody's got to answer because you never know who I'm going to pick on, right? You call on a random student and then provide performance feedback for them. You may be praising them for effort, for responding, and also making sure that they get it right or wrong. We got to be really careful when we do lots of opportunities to respond that we're really clear about whether the answer was right or not right. And that doesn't mean we have to have a buzzer, that says, wrong. But we got to be really careful because sometimes what we do is we might say, yeah, you have a question, yeah, you have something to share, you want to answer the problem up on the screen, and then you provide something, and I say, okay, anybody else have an answer? And then, unless you're really cued in, very subtly on my nonverbal communication, you might think that that answer is correct. And the problem is that becomes contagious, because then half the group might think the answer is correct. Okay. Some people are using, I think you talked about using the sticks. Sometimes people even call these equity sticks, which is kind of interesting. This is, a lot of people think of this as for elementary school. This is a middle school version where the students, these are tongue depressors, so they're a little wider, and students get to decorate their own sticks. Something to add just a little bit of ownership. So they get to decorate one side, and then their name is on the other side. In this case, they've got numbers on there. Somebody's super into mustaches. You could use an app like Randomly. This one's kind of interesting, where you can load all of your students on your device, on your phone, even on your watch. And you can click on, you got two ways of doing it. One is anybody who's not been called on yet, and one continues to be random. And the question, of course, is does it have to be random? Nope. Doesn't have to be random. It just has to look random enough. So one of the things that you want to think about is, can I get a student to be a little bit more successful by calling on them when I'm pretty sure I know what their answer is? So they might be doing their think, pair, share, as you were describing, and I'm going around and listening and making sure I'm going to call on somebody who might not always have the right answer all the time, but has got it, and I'm going to call on them. I might even use an approach called priming the pump, where I might even say for a student who needs a little bit more support responding, I might say, hey, I'm going to call on you, and this is going to be what the problem is going to be when we come back from the break. So take a look at it if you want to do it with me real quick, and then I'm going to ask you in front of the class. That can work well. Also having multiple correct answers. I've been using an example of that. Whiteboards. I will give you a link here so you can watch examples of using the whiteboards. Give you an example of using response cards. Those ones are just pre-written ones. They're usually different colors. So it's like, okay, everybody hold up blue if you think that's true. Hold up red if you think that's false. And that way you can have them do it quick. But one of the things that you really have to make sure you do is have them cue it so they're kind of hiding from each other and then all pull it up at once. Otherwise, some students are going to figure out that all they need to do is just sort of look around at the number of blue cards and then they just lift that one up. And then they're not actually doing choral responding. So anyways, I actually used a lot of call and response with you today when I asked people at the very beginning for you to shout out, that's me. I asked when you were working, you had the opportunity when we were close to say, I'm good, or hold on. And for those of you who are really participating, this is like one of those little sneaky things. It's called a micro-affirmation. I got a lot of you to say, probably more times than you've ever said in your life, I'm good. And so for some students who regularly hear that they are not good, even just vocalizing it can be a little bit of a trick, a little bit of a nudge, that if you provide a really positive environment for them in the classroom that is responsive to their values, their family's values, their needs, their interests, you're going to be more likely to see a little bit of equity. If you just focus on the trick of having kids say, I'm good, over and over again, it's not going to work. It's only if you provide the right environment for it. So thank you again for your time. Thank you all.